The house felt different ever since Jake's breakup with Lisa. It was as if a shadow had fallen over our home, dimming the once bright and lively space. Although the breakup didn't come out of nowhere, I had noticed the signs: fewer visits, less laughter, and a growing heaviness in Jake's eyes. Neither of us was truly prepared for the toll it would take on him. Jake had always been sensitive, wearing his heart on his sleeve. As a child, he felt everything deeply, and when he came home that night, pale and red-eyed, I knew immediately what had happened. He didn't say much, just collapsed onto the couch, his body folding in on itself. I sat beside him, sharing in his pain without speaking. I wanted to comfort him the way I did when he was younger, but I had learned that when it came to matters of his heart, I needed to let him come to me. "It's over," he whispered, staring blankly at the TV, though I could tell he wasn't really watching it. "I'm so sorry, Jake," I said gently. He nodded curtly, a single tear slipping down his cheek, which he quickly wiped away. It was painful to see him like this, but I knew he needed to feel this sorrow to start healing. The following days were quiet. Jake became a ghost in the house, mostly staying in his room, a door half closed between us. The house felt emptier, even though he was home more. His grief hung in the air like a heavy silence. About a week later, I found him sitting at the kitchen counter, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him, lost in thought. I decided to sit with him. Maybe tonight he'd open up. "Hey," I said softly, pouring myself some tea. "Do you want to talk about it?" He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to come to me for comfort, trusting me to make everything better. But this wasn't a pain I could fix with a Band-Aid. "There's not much to say," he replied flatly. "It just didn't work out." "I'm sorry," I said again, even though I knew it wasn't enough. "You really loved her, didn't you?" I asked. He nodded, fighting to keep it together. "Yeah, I thought we were going to get married. We talked about it." My heart sank. I hadn't realized how serious things had been. "I know you did," I said quietly, covering his hand with mine. He didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. He just stared at our joined hands. Over the next few weeks, Jake spent more time with me. He'd been staying away from friends and work, and it felt as if he was seeking solace in my company. I didn't mind. In fact, I cherished it. It had been a long time since we'd spent this much time together. One Saturday, I suggested we go for a walk in the park. The sun was shining, the sky a perfect blue. At first, Jake hesitated, but after some encouragement, he agreed. We walked in silence, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant sound of children playing. I kept glancing at him, noticing the stress in his face, the sadness in his eyes. "I don't know what to do with myself now," he suddenly said, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I had my whole future planned out with her," he said, his voice raw. "Now I feel lost. I don't know who I am without her." I stopped and turned to face him, placing my hand on his arm. "Jake, you're going to be okay," I said firmly. "You're still you. Maybe this is a chance for you to figure out who you are outside of a relationship. It will hurt for a while, but it won't last forever." He looked at me, searching for reassurance. "What if I don't get over her?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You will," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "And until then, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He pulled me into a tight hug, and for a moment, we stood there, clinging to each other in shared sorrow and love. As weeks turned into months, the weight in the house slowly began to lift. Jake started spending time with friends again and smiling more, but he still stayed close to me. Our walks became a regular ritual, and we talked about everything: his dreams, his fears, and even his childhood favorite movies. I realized I was getting to know him again, not as my little boy, but as the man he was becoming. Through all of this, I also found healing. The time we spent together wasn't just helping him, it was helping me too. When my younger son, Jack, began showing more attentiveness, it wasn't surprising. He had always been a caring child, bringing me flowers or asking how my day had gone. But as he grew older, his care took on a different intensity. At 22, Jack wasn't a boy anymore. He had become a strong, confident young man, yet his kindness had never left him. He helped with everything around the house, fixing leaks, cooking dinner when I was too tired. Having him around felt comforting, a reminder that I wasn't alone. One evening, while sitting together on the couch, we weren't watching TV. Instead, we were talking about his plans and hopes for the future. Then, unexpectedly, Jack said, his voice unusually soft, "You know, Mom, I feel like you and I understand each other more than anyone else," Jack said softly. I smiled, touched by his words. "We've always had a special connection, haven't we?" I responded. His gaze lingered on mine, and for a brief moment, a strange flutter stirred in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. It was fleeting, and I quickly dismissed it, telling myself it was merely a mother's affection for her child. But as the weeks passed, those moments became more frequent. He began sitting closer, his hand brushing against mine during quiet pauses, lingering longer than necessary. One evening, after dinner, I was washing the dishes when Jack approached from behind and wrapped his arms around my waist. It was a gesture he used to make when he was younger, innocent enough. But this time, it felt different. His grip was firmer, more intentional. I could feel his warm breath against my neck, shaky and uneven. "Jack," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "what are you doing?" He didn't pull away. Instead, he tightened his hold just a little and rested his chin on my shoulder. "I'm just giving you a hug, Mom. Is that so wrong?" There was something in his voice, a trace of vulnerability I hadn't heard before, that made my heart ache, but not in the way it should have. Gently, I pulled myself from his embrace and turned to face him with a forced smile. "Of course not, darling," I said, ruffling his hair like I did when he was younger. "But you're a grown man now. You don't need to cling to your mom." He gave me a small, sad smile, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe I do," he whispered before walking away, leaving me standing there, breathless and confused. From that point on, I began noticing everything. The way his eyes would linger just a bit too long, the way his hand would brush mine when we passed each other in the hall. It was subtle, but undeniable. He wasn't just being affectionate. There was something deeper, something I was afraid to confront. One rainy afternoon, I sat in the living room, gazing out the window as the rain slid down the glass. Jack walked in and sat beside me, so close that our legs touched. He didn't speak for a while, just sat there watching the rain fall with me. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "Yes," I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. He reached for my hand and gently took it in his. This time I didn't pull away. I let him hold it, feeling the warmth of his skin seep into mine. It felt wrong, but also strangely comforting. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking the stillness, "I need to tell you something." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The look in his eyes was intense, filled with an emotion I couldn't name but knew too well. I had seen that look before, but never directed at me. "Jack, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't." He held my hand tighter. "I can't help it. I've tried, but I can't." The raw honesty in his voice left me breathless. This was my son, the boy I had raised, the one I had comforted through scraped knees and broken hearts. But the man sitting in front of me now was different. There was a longing in his eyes, a need that frightened me. "We can't do this," I said, pulling my hand away, my voice steady despite the tears forming in my eyes. "This isn't right, Jack." He looked devastated, like a child lost in the world. "But you're everything to me," he said, his voice breaking. "You're my soulmate." The word hit me like a blow to the stomach. Soulmate. It wasn't a word a son should use for his mother, but there it was, hanging between us like a forbidden promise. I stood up, putting as much distance between us as I could. "You don't mean that," I said, my voice shaking. "You're confused. You've been taking care of me for so long, and it's clouded your judgment." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I know what I feel, and I think you do too." My breath hitched, and for a moment I let myself feel it. The connection, the pull between us that I had been denying for so long. But it was only a fleeting moment. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let us cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "I'm your mother," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "And I love you, but not like that. I can't." He looked at me, the pain in his eyes cutting deeper than anything I could have said. "I know," he said softly, "but I don't think I can stop feeling this way." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the living room. The rain continued to fall outside, each drop echoing the silent tears I could no longer hold back. The moonlight filtered through the thin curtains in my bedroom, casting pale silver patterns across the floor. I had been lying there for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. Jack had become more withdrawn recently, his usual playful spirit replaced by a quiet sadness that hung around him like a heavy fog. I could feel it, even if he didn't say a word. And it broke my heart, knowing that I was the cause. I turned onto my side, clutching the pillow close, trying to ease the ache in my chest. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling in the cool night air. I thought everyone was asleep, yet there was a part of me that couldn't find rest. I kept hearing his words in my head. You're my soulmate. How had we reached this point? How had I let things go so far? The emotions were raw, tangled, and impossible to ignore. And then I heard it, the soft creak of the door opening. I held my breath, my body tensing as the door slowly swung open. Jack stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "Jack?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he quietly closed the door behind him as if afraid to disturb the world outside this room. He stood there for a moment, hesitation written all over his face. It was the same look he had given me so many times recently, the one filled with unspoken words and forbidden feelings. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept dwelling on you, on us." My breath got caught in my chest, and I wanted to tell him to go back to his room, to pretend none of this was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just watched as he crossed the room, his footsteps inaudible on the carpet. He stopped at the edge of the bed, gazing down at me with an expression that was both fragile and resolute. "Jack, you shouldn't be here," I managed to say, but my voice lacked certainty. He shook his head, and before I could say another word, he climbed into the bed next to me. The mattress sank under his weight, and I could feel the warmth of his body pressing against mine. It was such a familiar comfort, but tonight it felt charged with something dangerous, something we had both been struggling so hard to deny. "Please," he murmured softly, his voice almost desperate. "Just let me stay here for a while. I don't want to be alone tonight." My heart tightened painfully. I understood what this meant, what we were on the brink of. I could feel the tension building between us, stronger than it had ever been, but I couldn't find the strength to push him away. Instead, I found myself turning toward him, our gazes meeting in the dim light. He reached up, his hand shaking slightly as it cupped my cheek. His touch was tender, almost reverent, as if he feared I might disappear if he held me too tightly. I leaned into his hand, despite myself, feeling the warmth of his palm against my skin. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending I don't love you like this." The words hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. I opened my eyes, seeing the raw pain and yearning in his gaze, and I knew I couldn't deceive him anymore. I couldn't deceive myself. "I know," I whispered back, my voice trembling. "I feel it too, but we can't, Jack. This isn't right." He moved closer, his forehead resting gently against mine. Our breaths mingled in the small space between us. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the restraint that he was barely managing to hold on to. "I've tried to stay away," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to push these feelings away, but I can't. I love you. I need you. Not as my mother, but as something more." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I knew this was wrong. Every instinct told me to push him away, to end it before it went any further, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into him, yearning for his warmth, his touch, the comfort I had been longing for so long. "Jack," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "If we do this, we can never go back." He pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes with a mixture of fear and hope. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "I don't care about anything else. I just want you." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in the softest kiss. It was tentative, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, turning frantic, years of unspoken desire spilling out in that moment. His hands roamed to my back, pulling me tightly against him, and I could feel his heartbeat pounding in sync with mine. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Intense, all-consuming, and so very wrong. But at the same time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When we finally pulled apart, both of us gasping for air, our foreheads touching as we tried to catch our breath, I could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty, but also the fierce determination. "We can't keep this a secret," he said quietly. "We can't keep pretending this isn't real." I nodded, tears spilling down my face. "I know," I whispered, "but I'm scared, Jack. I don't know what this means or how we move forward from here." He wiped my tears away with his thumb, his touch incredibly gentle. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Together." And in that moment, I believed him, because despite the fear, despite the guilt, I could no longer deny the truth. I loved him too, more than I should, more than was right, but it was real, and it was ours. We lay there in the darkness, holding each other as the moonlight bathed us in its soft glow. It felt like the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us entwined in a love that was as beautiful as it was forbidden. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace.